Coming up on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show.
In this analysis episode, I'm going to discuss what standards actually mean in IoT, how they're the same thing as protocols, and why we can't standardize everything, even if we wanted to.
All this and more on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show. The people, the business, and the technology of the next generation internet. This is the IoT Inc. Business Show. And now, here's your host, Bruce Sinclair.
Hello and welcome to the IoT Inc. Business Show. This show is made possible by sales of my book, IoT Inc., published by McGraw-Hill, and the IoT Inc. Certified IoT Professional, or ICIP, online training and certification program. Become a certified IoT professional by completing the program's 3 courses: ICIP Technology, ICIP Business, and ICIP Strategy and Digital Transformation. Details of which can be found at www.iot-inc.com. That's www.iot-inc.com. Hello everybody, this is Bruce Sinclair. I'm your host, and thank you for listening to this episode of the IoT Business Podcast. I'm going to be doing an analysis episode on IoT protocols. If you're on my mailing list, then you receive my newsletter. I only send it out every couple weekends, but you'll receive my newsletter, and the last one was on this topic on IoT protocols, and it seemed to really hit a nerve. I got a lot of responses, a lot more than normal, and so I thought I would take a bit of time to discuss the issue in a little bit more depth here on this podcast. It's a little bit abstract, so hopefully it's going to work in the audio format, but I think I should be able to get across my key points. So the first thing is when you talk about protocols, there's a relationship to standards. So really, when you're talking about standards, you're actually talking about protocols. If you're talking about standardizing IoT, for example, you're talking about standardizing the protocols that IoT uses. These protocols, most of them anyway, are in the networking realm. And so they're networking protocols. I'm going to be talking about a fourth protocol, which is more of an information-based protocol, which is also very important. But these protocols or standards, you can also think of them as interfaces. They're really interfaces of different parts of software that need to be connected together. Now, standards are really important. Generally, they're very important. If you think about the IoT and the trillions of dollars and the millions of sensors, or I should say billions of sensors that are supposed to be deployed in the next, depends on your analysis of choice, but that's supposed to be deployed, let's say, within the next 5, 10, 15 years, then all these, I think, projections ignore something that's really important, and that is the complexity of actually deploying an IoT solution. I see this all the time with my clients. So stating the Internet of Things needs to be standardized really is a little bit too simplistic. So let's get into it a little bit, and to do that, we're going to peel back the layers of IoT in order to understand a little bit better. And I guess the first main message here is that there are multiple layers. It's not just one standardization, protocol, or interface. Remember, they're all pretty much synonymous with each other, but there's multiple layers. Some of these layers can be standardized and others cannot. Now, the key word here that I want to talk about is operational technology, or OT. If you've never heard this term before, OT stands for specific networking technology for different industries. Before there was an Internet of Things, each industry evolved their networking tech separately. They could. They didn't. This is more or less one of the big differences between M2M and IoT versus IoT, is that these networks were not leaving So they were intranets. They were not internets of things. They were not leaving the local environment. Now, whether that local environment was home, was SCADA, or let's say a manufacturing environment, or plane, trains, or automobiles, the point was that they all kind of evolved separately to meet their particular needs. And since they never were intended to communicate with other, I'm going to use the word first time here, silos, then there was really no need to think of it any differently. And there was really no need to reuse what was already invented, because really it wasn't that complicated. Now, although there's a lot of tremendous returns when deploying an IoT product system environment, it's expensive. And it's certainly not for the faint of heart. And one of the biggest reasons for these expenses and for this faintness, I guess, is integration. Now, if you think about it, any industry that needs system integrators to do that integration certainly isn't plug and play, certainly isn't standardized. In particular is the fog layer that we have the biggest problem with. Now, the fog layer, although if you listen to the previous podcast, the Open Fog Consortium defines it a little bit more widely than I do. But most folks define the fog as the networking that goes from the sensor, so right at the very edge, and it can include the edge, all the way to the backhaul. And the backhaul is the connection to the internet, so you can do the Internet of Things. Now, in between there, we have the OT network and we have the IT network. And the OT network, like I said, is very specific networking technology for a specific industry, for a particular industry. And this is where it certainly is not standardized. At some point, though, you're moving over. Generally, it's going to be over the air to another box that's going to another piece of network equipment that's going to then translate it into Internet protocol to go on the IT network. So think about the fog as the OT network and the IT network, and the issues are in this OT part of the fog layer. Now, this is where the famous silos came from. And they result in vendor lock-in. But, the real question is, given the wide range of IoT use cases, is it really even possible or practical to standardize on a single networking technology? Well, the answer is complicated. It's complicated. Networking is layered. So we've probably all heard of the term the networking stack. Well, it's a stack of layered networking protocols. So IoT shares the same networking stack as IOP, Internet of People. And this is what I want to get into a little bit more. Now, there are actually, when you think about it, or when you look at it, I should say, there's actually 3 networking protocols in IoT, not one. So when people talk about standards, there isn't a single protocol or a single standard in IoT. You need to look at 3 different standards or protocols or interfaces. Remember, they're all synonymous with each other. And possibly a 4th one that I want to talk about. This is the part where hopefully it's not going to be too confusing to talk about it versus point to a diagram. But I want you to visualize Russian dolls. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but they're called the Matryoshka dolls. And these are those nested dolls that are one inside the other. And this is a good way to think about how data is moved through the Internet of Things, starting at the sensor and then going up to the application. So the smallest little doll is going to be the data. That's the one on inside. Now, wrapped around the data is going to be the application layer. Again, the next little doll. Wrapped around the application layer is going to be the networking layer, the next doll. And then wrapped around the networking layer is going to be the media layer. That's another doll. So you've got each nested doll has a different, let's say, outside color or painting or characteristics. And depending on where you are in the networking stack or where you are in the network, moving your way from the sensor to the application, you're going to be exposing a different one of these Matryoshka dolls. And you're going to be changing the order when you go in the other way. So let me use an example. So you capture a piece of data from your sensor. The first thing that we do is we want to wrap it with an application layer. So this is a protocol. So here I am, and I'm introducing another term. So layer, protocol, same thing as standard or interface. But we're going to call them layers. So you're wrapping around the piece of data with an application layer. The application layer, this is an example. These are examples like XMPP, RESTful HTML, MQTT, CoAP, DDS. What they do is they put contextual information around the data. And this is really important to have this contextual information. It's important because you want to, like web programming, you don't want to have to know how the data was stored to know what it was. Data stored in register 562, comma, that's a big array, comma, 52B, it's hex, comma, some other thing represents temperature. Now, the reason you want to capture that information, even though it's more data that you're going to be stringing along with the original actual number, 57.6, that was our original data that we captured from the sensor. You want to put the contextual information along with each one of these pieces of data because it's far more efficient to transfer that data and interpret it than to have to do some lookup table, have to do some sort of a transformation once you have it in your application to understand what is this again? What is this 57.5? So that's the application layer, that's the application protocol, that's the application interface. That goes around, that's the next doll that goes around the data, that temperature data that we talked about. The next thing you need to do is wrap that application protocol with a networking protocol or networking layer, networking interface. Think again, it's just the way it looks, and so you can transport it along the network. So this networking layer gets to that fog area that I was talking about. It gets to the transport of the information over the OT and the IT. So the networking layer, that doll that's wrapped around the application layer, which is wrapped around the data, it's used to transport that piece of information to 57.5 degrees Celsius, let's say, for some motor, from that, let's say it's a CAN bus, so it's an automotive network, OT network, to get across to and up in the cloud and then to our product cloud and then eventually into our application. That's the problem where we have different protocols for the OT networks. And because we need to go then into the internet, because of the Internet of Things, we're going to have to do a translation at some point to IT. And the protocol, there's only one protocol in IT, and that's the Internet protocol. So we have in the home, we have OT protocols like Zigbee and Z-Wave. In the car, I mentioned CAN bus. You've got Modbus, Profibus, in manufacturing environments. Again, they're all very specific to that particular operational technology, to that particular tech. In their example here, we were in a car, so the CAN bus. Wrapped around the networking layer is going to be the media layer. Now, the media layer is going to help it along whatever the media is, and it can be wired, or generally it's wireless. But it can be wired or wireless, and it needs to be effectively put into a form that it can be sent over the air. So now we've heard these as well. So here's a whole bunch of other ones: Bluetooth, Thread, 6LoW, 802.15.4. These are for lossy networks. We have Thread, We also have 3G. We've got all the cellular tech, and we have LPWAs, and we've talked about these before in the podcast too, like LoRa or Sigfox. So that's another nested doll. So we're picturing it. And I'm not sure this car example is going to be that great, but we get a piece of data. We wrap that temperature data saying, yeah, it's temperature data. It's coming from this cylinder on this engine in this car, maybe even in this geography, maybe using GPS, but you can see we're putting a lot of information around it. That's the application protocol or the application layer. Then wrapped around that, because we need to send it on the network now, first into CAN bus, so that's going to be in the automobile. So we wrap it around with a protocol. So basically all that means is we're organizing that information in such a way that it can be moved along that network. And then let's say, okay, maybe the example works okay. Then when you stop in your garage, you upload the data, and it does it by radio. And so we need to put a media layer, and let's say it's Wi-Fi. I don't know if I mentioned that, but it can be Wi-Fi. So then we put another doll around it, or another packaging around that networking layer, around that application layer, around that data to send it over the air. And then we just do the reverse. We unpack it on the other side. But in some cases, like in this particular example, that unpacking also has to have a translation. So the first thing we do is we strip off the media layer. So it's like a codec almost. So it goes over the air, we catch it, and we say, okay, we can unwrap that one doll. We don't need that anymore because all we needed that for was to send it over the air. So now what's left is that networking protocol. This one, we don't understand that. We're on the home network, and pretty much any IT network is going to be IP-based. So we need to now translate that into IP. So that's an extra step. So now we're changing the doll, I suppose, if we want to keep on using this metaphor. Now it's the IP layer. So now we send it. It connects up to our home router, and our home modem, whether it's a cable modem or let's say it's a telco modem, and goes out from our home, connects to fiber, and gets up into the cloud or into the public internet, or into the public cloud of the internet, I should say. All right, so now it's still moving. It has that networking layer, still that one particular Russian doll on it, because it's IP, so it's that IP Russian doll. It's moving along the internet, and it's finding our particular product cloud, and then within our product cloud, there could be our application. Our application can live in a few different places, but let's say our application for this data is in our product cloud. So the first thing is that we now have it there. So now we need to unpack it. Great. So we take off the networking layer, and remember what was in there. What was inside the networking layer when we unpack that doll was the application layer, the application protocol interface. We can use all the words synonymously. And it's great, right? Because now we have it in our application, and we know what that 57.5 was. We know it's for temperature. We know the owner of that vehicle. We know where in the vehicle it was, and we do our work on it. So those are the three layers, and if you include the data inside, so those are the three layers that we need to think about in IoT. Now there's a fourth layer also, and this is what you call an information protocol. The information protocol is how do you organize, or what is the form of the information that you put in the application layer. So you're not just randomly saying in some cases, in a car situation, in some cases, you're going to label it as a cylinder. In some cases, you're not going to talk about the cylinder. You're going to talk about the engine block. I'm just using silly examples here just to try to illustrate the point. But there is an information layer, which isn't so much a doll in a sense. I guess you could think of it that way, I suppose. But it's really, I guess you can think of it that way. You can think of it as another layer of the doll. I don't know if this is working, but another layer of the doll around the other layers that basically says, this is how we're organizing information, and it's done in a very standard way. Let me get back to the information layer later. So now if we think about this and we see that there are those different layers of protocols, then it's not practical and it doesn't make sense, because on the application layer, maybe in the information layer, but in the application layer, we're going to need different types of application or of application protocols. So this is the format of how we attach the information to it, so that contextual information to it for different purposes. Information layer, maybe we can standardize on that, but it probably makes sense that we're going to need different ones, at least for different architectures. So there's two different types of architecture. You have message-based architectures in IoT, and you have client-server-based architectures. So at a minimum, we're going to need a couple different application protocols, layers, interfaces, standards, to be able to accommodate those different types of architectures. Because remember, it's the app, and then we're going to get it into the app. Going all the way to the media layer, and this was sending it over the air. I didn't talk about Ethernet, but that's another format if you're going to send it over the wire. But those are going to be required. We need them to be different as well. We're going to have, in some cases, like Bluetooth, it's going to make sense when they're really close, and we need a higher but lower power. In some cases, if we have power, Wi-Fi is going to make sense. If they're in the middle of nowhere, we're going to need to use cellular, or maybe it's going to be some sort of LPWA format. So you can see, it doesn't make sense. These are not going to standardize either. However, going back to that fog layer that I identified earlier, that is indeed an area that we can standardize. And the Internet of Things must be based on a standard networking layer, the same one as we're basing the Internet of People on, and that is IP. Now, IP helps us in a lot of ways. It reduces a lot of friction. Integration. Some people actually jokingly call IP the integration protocol. It's known by everybody. It can be used. It's skill sets that can be found pretty much anywhere, so it can be used very easily. Security is another area. It's not perfect, but we've done a lot of work on IP security with all the equipment that go around it. I don't think we want to trust, OT security in all those different verticals. It's not going to be as secure as the security that you can wrap around an IP-based networking protocol. Scale is another area. We have to scale this up to, according to the analysts, 50 billion devices, 20 billion devices. There's going to be a lot of them. IP protocol has already done that with the Internet of People. And interoperability, and this is where you get into costs, where you can reduce costs. I mean, IP is used with all the radios, so it's the media layer. It's used everywhere. And so if we can start standardizing that fog, and in particular that OT layer, it means that we don't need to do that translation, which has very big security implications. And it means that it can be integrated more easily. We don't need to have specialized, personnel to be able to work with the different silos. Better security, it's scalable. And interoperability does bring, if we can use components that can be used for any industry at the networking layer, so this is going to be equipment like gateways. On the IT world, there are routers and switches. In the OT world, in the IoT world, you often talk about gateways, Internet of Gateways. So again, if we can use common equipment, it's going to reduce the cost. So going back to layer 4, I think, right now I'm looking closely at MT Connect for manufacturing. It just has to do with some of the work I'm doing with one of my clients. And it's not clear in my mind, maybe this is another layer, standard interface, protocol that we may not be able to standardize either. It may just be the networking protocol, unless we can come up with one taxonomy that works for all information types. I'm not really sure. But again, that was the information, that was a structured way of what information to capture. Whereas the application protocol was saying, this is the information I have, and this is the way it's laid out. So the big takeaways here for this podcast, and hopefully the Russian doll thing worked. I don't know. Hopefully it did work. But the big takeaways are there's 3 or 4 layers of standardization. So when people talk about standardizing the Internet of Things, it's not just standardizing one thing. And remember, standardization is synonymous with protocols, which is the interfaces between, or the layers in that networking stack that are interfaced between the different parts of that Remember my example going from the sensor on the engine all the way up into your application in the product cloud. So there's not one, there's 3 or 4. The biggest problem, the second takeaway here is the biggest problem is at the networking layer. We use IP for the Internet of People. We should be using IP for the operational technology as well. Now, it's not all perfect. I mean, especially if you start getting into IPv6, you've got a lot of extra data because of the packet size, the headers on the packet size, and there's ways, and that's what 6LoWPAN does. Threads uses it as well, where you do different techniques to compress it. It's not perfect, but the benefits far outweigh, in my view, the problems associated with it. So do your part. I do when I'm looking at my requirements and I'm looking at the OT network. I am pretty much, I can't think of actually a case where I've been involved with a client where I've not forced the issue on IP. So you can do the same thing. Go to your system integrator, talk to your system integrator, or talk to your internal development staff and force the issue of IP. Don't just, it may not be practical in all cases, but if possible, force the issue of IP using IP at that networking layer across your entire fog layer, and you'll benefit in a lot of different ways.
Okay. Hopefully that was an interesting monologue. This podcast goes vertical, deep diving into different topics each week. If you prefer a more horizontal and structured approach to learning IoT business and its orbiting technologies, check out my book IoT Inc., published by McGraw-Hill, or become a certified IoT professional by completing the ICIP training and certification program. For details, just go to www.iot-inc.com. Also go to www.iot-inc.com for an analysis of this episode, links to things that were mentioned during the episode, and very importantly, the episode's PDF transcript. Just search for the name of the episode or the guest. If you're new to this podcast, subscribe. That way you'll get every week's episode delivered straight to your device. Or, if you've been listening for a while, there are 3 ways you can support the show. You can leave a rating or a review on iTunes. Just go to iot-inc.com/iTunes. It only takes 1 click to leave a rating, a little bit longer to leave a review. You can share it on social. I'm on LinkedIn, to a lesser extent on Twitter. And of course, you can support this show by buying my book, IoT Inc., or the ICIP training and certification program. It's how I pay the bills. Next week's episode is Discover the Secrets of Low Power Wide Area Networks with Hari Schmidbauer of the LoRa Alliance and Thomas Nichols of Sigfox. Hope you can join me then. I'm your host, Bruce Sinclair. Thank you for listening. Until next week, may your path to IoT business be a simplified one.
You have been listening to the IoT Inc. Business Show.